Ladies and gentlemen, please silence your cell phones. The session is about to begin.
Please welcome NBC News Chief, Foreign Affairs Correspondent, and host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you all so much. It's a great honor to be here at such an important time, to be at this conference and with such wonderful panelists. So we look forward to the session. I am here to introduce two extraordinary people. First, Secretary Ray Mabus, former United States Secretary of the Navy under President Obama, former governor of Mississippi, someone who has dealt with these issues, who has been an ambassador in Saudi Arabia, who understands the energy situation and also how to deal with it as the governor of a state dealing with floods, disasters, hurricanes, and the like. Secretary Mabus, thank you very much. And secondly, someone, with all due respect to Secretary Mabus, let me just say, someone who has been my personal hero for a very long time, as a former White House correspondent covering 2 terms of Ronald Reagan's presidency. We are very honored here today to have the Secretary of State for 7 years under President Reagan, George P. Shultz, former United States Secretary of State, a longtime environmental leader. Secretary Shultz's service to our country began under President Eisenhower. He's a former Marine. He also served as Treasury Secretary, Secretary of Labor, and head of OMB. So with that, we all feel appropriately intimidated by the expertise of our panelists. Let me join you. Just to set the stage, climate change is very real. It's happening now. It's happening on the southeast coast in the Carolinas, as we know from the hurricane, which has thankfully been downgraded to a tropical storm, but still is a major flood event. Through floods, droughts, fires, as we've seen the worst fire season ever in California, changing temperatures, it continues to escalate unstable situations into catastrophic situations. The effects of climate change are already being felt through these issues of flood and water insecurity, escalating migration, and intensifying conflicts into real national security challenges. While the natural impacts of climate change continue to increase, the impact upon security and stability is dependent on the actions of nations, of regions, of cities, and businesses. So we're here today at a moment in our national history to welcome global leaders and talk about these issues. So first, Secretary Shultz, I wanted to talk about the national climate. Republicans, as you have pointed out in the past, Republicans have been conservationists since Teddy Roosevelt. I remember when President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. We've had William Ruckelshaus and Russell Train and other.
OMB when he did that.
And so
when a new agency is created, they get people in space from others, and there's nobody there. So the director of OMB becomes their head, and you fight for them. And OMB is a good representative because we know where the bodies are buried, and nobody wants to mess with us.
Well, so how does we reach a point where conservation environmentalists are viewed in such a partisan context, and where at least the Republican leadership right now in Washington are not willing to embrace this as a cause that has no political boundaries?
Well, I think people are coming around because of what you say. It's perfectly obvious that the climate is changing. It's not a matter of science. There's a new ocean being created in the Arctic. How did that happen? The ice cap over Greenland is melting. Tropical diseases are coming north. We need to get prepared for it. I mean, this is clear stuff. It's happening. You can see it. So pretty soon it's impossible for anybody to be stupid enough not to realize this is happening.
Well, you have been an environmentalist for a long time. Tell me about your personal experience. Your car, I thought, I drive a hybrid. You drive an electric car. How did you reach that conclusion? And
Well, we have a
how
home,
has it changed your life?
We have a home down on the Stanford campus, and about 10 years ago, we put solar panels on the roof. And I've long since paid for them by what I've saved on my electricity bill. And they produce more electricity than my car uses. So what's the cost of my fuel? Nothing. What's not to like?
Governor Mavis, or Mr. Secretary, or Ambassador, I don't know, you have so many titles. Talk to me about what governors can do, local officials and state officials, in the absence of federal leadership.
Well, I think that this conference is a great example. The things that California are doing in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of moving toward a completely renewable energy future, in terms of, when I was Secretary of the Navy, we worked very closely with California, for example. We were able to sign the lease for the biggest fleet of electric vehicles that were ever signed because California officials were willing to work with us to do it, and because the infrastructure was here in order to recharge those vehicles, in order to maintain them when it wasn't in other states. But other states and other governors can take these leadership roles, and a lot of them are taking these leadership roles. And I think in the history of America, a lot of times the great ideas, the laboratories of democracy, are the states, and the ideas bubble up to Washington and not the other way around.
Now, as Secretary of the Navy, you certainly had to be concerned about rising sea levels. I think about the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain or Norfolk, Virginia. These are places that are going to be underwater, literally, as the sea continues to rise, unless we deal with it, unless we try to intermediate it.
When I was the nominee to be secretary, one of the things that kept jumping out at me in my briefings was how energy, fuel, climate was a weapon. It could be used against us, or we could use it. And so I came out with the goal that by no later than 2020, at least 50% of all naval energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources. We got there on our bases 5 years early, 2015. Today, 2/3 of all energy being used by naval bases in the United States, Marine bases. And I'm happy to be here with Captain George Schultz, USMC, who 2/3 of the energy is renewable today. At sea, it's about 40%. We did it for exactly what you're talking about. I mean, we're the Navy. Our bases tend to be on the shore, on the coast. And Norfolk in particular will disappear within the lives of people alive today. It's not a theoretical thing. And it is we did it, or I did it, for warfighting purposes. It makes us a stronger, better military. And as Secretary Schultz pointed out, there's a new ocean being created in the Arctic. There's going to be more conflict, more friction. Russia has already said that the waters to its north are internal waters. They're not. U.S. Navy is going to be the one that has to deal with that.
How do you see this whole issue as a national security threat, to follow up on what Secretary Mavis just said, Secretary Schultz, in terms of migration, drought, conflict around the world? We can just look at the Middle East, look at Northern Africa. Where are the sort of areas where climate change and global warming have created potential, conflicts that the United States is going to have to face?
Well, the demography of the world is changing radically. I won't go into all of it, but nevertheless, the population of the world continues to increase, but most of it is in Africa and some Asian countries. But those countries tend to be places where the economic prospects are not great, and they're very likely going to see drought-type conditions that make it, that affects their food supply. So people are going to wind up wanting to migrate. And we're not ready for that, but it's going to be very important. We should, of course, try to help them have a good economy and do something about the climate. And people don't realize how easy it is to do something about the climate.
What are some of the solutions? Let's talk about, for
Well,
instance,
first,
the
here's the
carbon
first
fee
thing.
and dividend policy.
Here's the first thing to do. Use energy more efficiently. We have made a study of that, and there's a huge amount that's been done. Like, why do we have to have these lights so bright? No kidding. You save a lot if you just do things a little differently. You got that. Then, if you will cause people to have to look around for carbon by putting a revenue-neutral carbon tax there.
A revenue-neutral carbon tax. Now,
Right.
let's talk about that, because
Revenue-neutral means you give the money back to people, so there's no fiscal drag from the tax. And it also makes it a progressive tax. Our proposal is let the Social Security Administration administer it. That's a bureaucracy that takes in money and pays it out. So they take this money out and they pay the same amount out to each person with a Social Security number. And people, every once in a while, you get your little carbon dividend check, not bad. So it'll be popular. But then the big thing is to support energy R&D. And when the government puts up $1, at least at Stanford and MIT are the two places I'm most familiar with, the private money is about 3 to 1, so it's very high-powered. And a lot has been accomplished. We talked about electric cars. Well, now they have, R&D has produced batteries that are smaller, lighter, much more powerful, and cheaper. So the electric car is here, but it's due to the R&D. Now, I'm going to take a group of people, scientists from MIT and Stanford, to Washington I'll be there on Tuesday. We'll see if anybody will come. We're going to tell them about breakthroughs. For example, we are on the cusp of large-scale storage of electricity. That is dramatic because it takes the intermittency problem out of solar and wind energy, and it changes everything. It's also possible to take carbon out of the air. It's expensive, but people are learning how to do it. So there are all kinds of things you can do, and the R&D keeps producing them, so we should work on that hard.
All of this requires science, and we've had, frankly, a White House that has been disputing the need for science. We have science panels being dismissed at the EPA. Secretary Mabus, how can we deal with the federal government now challenging California on methane, fuel emissions policy? We seem to be regressing when it comes to a national policy.
Well, I think you're right that we're regressing in terms of the federal government, but you're not regressing in terms of state and local government. You're not regressing in terms of business, who are usually not altruistic figures. They understand that this is an economic as well as a security issue. And if I could just follow up real quickly at what Secretary Schultz said, as you're getting more droughts, more intense storms, as food supplies become more iffy, as famine, as disruption becomes chaos, from a military standpoint, our Navy and Marines are our first responders. And so from our security standpoint, with the immigration, with the migration around the world, we have got to do something about this for our security interest, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's because it's in our best interest. But I almost think you ignore Washington, because they're not saying anything good, and they're not right about anything. And so, to Secretary Schultz's point, we are, the Holy Grail is the storage. That was the thing we faced on bases and at sea. It's a science project now. It's going to happen. Last thing I'll say is, we had a chief in the Navy that recommended that we change the light bulbs on our ships to go from incandescent, fluorescent to LEDs. And when it got suggested, I said, oh, okay, but is that really something that helps that much? Changing the light bulb on a destroyer, which is one of our smaller ships, saves 25,000 gallons of fuel a year. And you don't have to change them but every 7 years. And the light's better. Other than that, it's sort of a wash.
A lose-lose proposition. And you were saying also that one of the real issues as Secretary of the Navy is supply lines, and to diminish the need for reliance on as the supply lines for fuel is to save lives in conflict zones.
We were losing a Marine killed or wounded for every 50 convoys of fuel we brought into Afghanistan. And I just thought that was too high a price to pay. So we started giving things like rollable solar panels. Secretary Schultz used to carry one around to show people. We just gave it to Marines. They used it to power their GPS and their radios. It saved a company of Marines 700 pounds of batteries, and they didn't have to be resupplied. And so now the Marines, who are not known as ardent environmentalists, are sort of leading the way on alternatives. They're making energy where they fight. So you don't have to be resupplied. You don't have to worry about that. And the last thing, on a bigger supply thing, you can make a very good argument that the economic success the world has seen, particularly in Asia, since World War II, is a direct result of the United States Navy, because it's kept the sea lanes open for everybody. It's kept the sea lanes open not just for its allies, not just for itself, but everybody. And if you begin to have these conflicts based on climate change, that goes away, and if that goes away, the basis of the economy could come crashing down pretty fast.
I noted that Admiral James DeVries, someone you probably both know well and who's been one of our newer colleagues at NBC, wrote recently for Bloomberg that the U.S. is not only surrendering a position of global leadership on this crucial issue of climate, but it's laying itself open to real security risks in the decades ahead. If the Trump White House insists on ignoring the inevitable, the professionals at the relevant departments and agencies have to take it upon themselves to develop real strategies and put real resources into keeping the U.S. and its global interests secure far into an uncertain future. You could argue that we don't have to face the immediacy of backing out of the Paris Agreement until 2020. But the fact is that we have taken a big step backwards and let China lead the way on solar and some of these other technologies. Is that a fact that we can ameliorate?
We're doing it. That's what this is all about. There has been an uprising in a lot of states. You withdraw it from the Paris Agreement, but we didn't, and we're going to do something about it. And the reaction has exploded.
You were part of the Montreal protocols under President Reagan, which began to address the ozone issue all the way back then in the 80s.
Yeah, but the Montreal Protocol, it's an interesting story, because scientists began to see that the ozone layer was depleting. And we had a little science group in the State Department. We were part of this. And I became convinced, and I had 2 private meetings a week with President Reagan, and he became convinced that the scientists who were worried were right, but there were some who disagreed. So President Reagan did something that they don't do anymore. Nowadays, if somebody disagrees with you, you try to demolish them. He put his arm around them and said, you don't agree with us, we respect that, but you do agree that if it happens, it's a catastrophe. So why don't we take out an insurance policy? Now that appealed. That didn't get him on our side, but it got him off our back. And we got the Montreal Protocol out of it. And looking back now, I think practically everybody would agree that the scientists who were worried were right, and the Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So the insurance policy concept is something to have in the back of your mind as a way of persuading people who are a little reluctant to come around.
You've had to deal with practical politics. What do you do when you have the argument that for the coal miners in West Virginia, for the steel workers in Pennsylvania, for others in older industries, that their jobs are threatened by some of these environmental regulations?
Well, anytime you have one of these shifts, and it's happened throughout our history and throughout history, these disruptions disproportionately hurt certain people and disproportionately help some people. And part of, I think, our responsibility in government is to do two things. Number one is to explain why it's for the greater good that you move away from some of these older industries, that it's going to not only affect us as a country, it's going to affect you as an individual. If your child has asthma, you ought to be worried about this. But then it's also to understand the disruption that's happening with the coal miners in West Virginia or the steel workers in Pennsylvania, and give them a transition, retraining, a safety net. They don't lose their insurance, that they can move into the new economy where the wages tend to be better, where the conditions tend to be safer. I mean, the Museum for Coal in Kentucky has solar panels on the roof. I mean, that's telling us something. But I do think we have a responsibility not to just say, yeah, you're in trouble. Good luck with that. I think we as a government, we as a people, have a responsibility to do that. And again, to follow up on one of my heroes too, Secretary Schultz. Inside the government today, inside the Pentagon, I'll just keep it on a military, they are continuing to do the work on energy. They're continuing to do the work on climate change. And they're doing it because it's now become, and I'd like to think the Navy is still ahead, and I believe it, but it's all the services. They know it gives them an edge. They know it makes them better war fighters. They're not going to give that up for ideology. They're not going to give that up. They're not going to be as public about it. They're not going to talk about it as much. But they see the dangers. And it's become such an ingrained part of our military, the risk that climate change brings, that there's still a lot of great work that's going on, regardless of what the policy proclamations that are coming out from other places.
Secretary Schultz, how do you deal with debates over how many people died in Puerto Rico when a scientific study and the governor of Puerto Rico says one thing and it's denied by the President of the United States?
Well, you say, what are the facts, and let's get them out there, and that's it. And it's also true, I think, that one of the things that President Trump is bringing about is a decentralization. A new federalism is taking place. And people are saying more and more, well, Washington has some things to do, but let's do more here, where we know each other, and we talk to the people who are the mayor and the governor and so on. And it's real. And I'll give an example. Certainly it's a responsibility of the federal government to guard our borders. But whatever happens, happens. Now, not long ago, over in Oakland, a woman who came illegally a little over 20 years ago, she's working as a nurse in an Oakland hospital, doing a good job. She has 3 children. 2 of them are grown up and working. 1 was younger. They deport her. We say, this is not us. And we will say, well, okay, if she's here, that's our problem now. Get off our back. More and more people are beginning to feel that way. I'm sorry, I know you live in Washington, Andrea, but there are other parts of the country.
I am well aware of it.
If you look at the Constitution, and I've been reading about our early days a little bit more to remind ourselves, it was very clear that the states said, we just got rid of London. Why do we want to have a big bureaucracy in Washington working on us? So the Constitution really provided that Washington would do national security and foreign affairs, but most of the other things would be left in the hands of the states. So in San Francisco, we can have Chinatown. They don't have to have it in Atlanta. It's okay. We can be different. And one of the things that happens as a result of our diverse, we're all immigrants here. Everybody here is an immigrant or descendant from one. So we're very diverse. So we have learned more about how to govern over diversity than most places. It's hard still, but still we're doing it. My wife, who's chief of protocol here, she helps govern San Francisco because here's what she does. There are about 70 consulates in San Francisco, 70 consulates, very diverse city. So every country has a national day, like we have the 4th of July. So on every country's national day, Charlotte has a little ceremony in City Hall. They fly that country's flag. They sing its national anthem. They have a little wine and cheese. A lot of people show up, tears in their eyes. And she says, welcome. You're welcome here, and your diversity adds to our creativity. And we're glad to have you wanting to live in this energetic city. So it's governing over diversity.
Well, and as you point out, Charlotte Schultz, who's with us today, has done tremendous things for many, many years for the country, but for the city of San Francisco. And I know you were involved in emergency response in Mississippi in the past, and as well for the country under President Obama. What we now had this past week is the revelation that money was being transferred out of FEMA to be used for response and recovery into ICE to be used to build detention centers, which is an extension of the immigration policy that Secretary Schultz is talking about.
Yep. Again, I think that Secretary Schultz is absolutely right. A lot of this is devolving on states. And as a former governor, I think that's a great trend. We don't all have to be alike, but the federal government, for things like FEMA, for things like the response to these hurricanes, they've got to play this role. And I think your profession of shining a spotlight on when things like that happen. And I think it's up to us as citizens of this country to just rise up for South Carolina, North Carolina, the notion that they are not going to be as well resourced, as well protected because of some political ideology is just so wrong. The notion that Puerto Ricans died and the President of the United States claims they didn't, or claims it was a partisan plot, those undermine the very basis of our democracy. And I think that doing things like this, but being engaged every day, not letting people get away with it, not letting your local congressman, senator, not letting your local state legislator, not letting your city council get away with these things is one of our big responsibilities.
Now, Secretary Schultz parenthetically mentioned he's going to Washington next week to talk to leaders there about new technologies. The fact that you, after all of your experience, are going to Washington, D.C. to advocate for what is being done at Stanford and MIT on energy storage and on solutions for the future is, I think, the most reaffirming aspect of anything that I've learned here today, I have to say. It's just such a tribute to the constant inventiveness of your mind and of your public service.
Well, it's the MIT and Stanford faculty people are terrific, both places. And they work hard on these issues. And so we're going to go. I hope somebody comes. I don't know when anybody will come. After Washington is interested in stuff like that, but we're going to be there and we're going to tell them.
And to meet with members of the House and Senate, presumably. I don't know if you have any meetings. Well, you do have some meetings scheduled with members of the administration.
Well, we've invited a bunch of people, and the House isn't in session, but maybe somewhere around or staff will come. And some senators, I'm sure, will come.
The fact that the academic world and the corporate world are so heavily invested in this, intellectually and economically, is really one of the great pathways forward.
No, I think that both those institutions, but particularly the corporate world, I think it's very notable that when policies change at EPA, when pronouncements against science are made, when things are scaled back, a lot of the pushback is coming from the corporate sector. They know they've got to transition into a much cleaner future. They know, just financially, it makes no sense to do anything else. And if you try to prop up dying industries at the expense of emerging ones, you end up wrecking our economy for a long, long time, and they recognize that.
We've learned a lot today. We want to thank you, Ray Mabus, George Schultz. Thank you both. Thank you for your service.
And I want to thank Andrea, because you do a great job of your broadcasting. And when you say something, I mostly all believe it.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we are going to introduce the next panel, the closing panel of this session, who are going to be coming out as soon as we rearrange the chairs here. First of all, Major General David S. Baldwin is the Adjutant General of the California National Guard. He, of course, has also in the past had deployments in Afghanistan and knows very well what some of these conflict zones mean in terms of the challenges. Also with us, the Honorable Shukri Haji Ismail Bandari from Somaliland, who has seen many of its share of challenges, from insecurity to natural resource scarcity to a changing climate. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Mayor Mohammed Sahid Kokon, is not well and is not going to be able to join us today. We will be sorry for missing him. But also with us is Kevin Rabinovich, who has been talking a great deal about the roles of government and the military and the private sector as well. And the Honorable Sharon Burke is joining us as well. Thank you from New America. Thank you all so much. Let me join you. General Baldwin, let me start with you about what we've been facing. We know what our friends and neighbors on the southeast coast and the Carolinas are facing. You have had to deal with the wildfires and other natural disasters in California. How can the government, the military, the states handle these challenges?
Well, first, the National Guard has been on the front lines of dealing with climate change in the recent years. During the early parts of my career, when we were doing our domestic missions, we would see a catastrophic event that would cause the deployment of large numbers of National Guardsmen, maybe once every 4 or 5 years. Last year in the California National Guard, we did 7. 5 here in California and 2 responding to hurricanes in the east and in Texas. So we are seeing firsthand how we need to change the way that we operate, how we, both for our domestic operations as our overseas operations. It's important that government security forces take climate change into account when planning for their future budgets, for planning how they're going to train and organize, and recognize the effects that climate change is having on causing instability around the globe.
How has recruitment been affected by this? I mean, these are challenges where you have multiple deployments, domestically as well as overseas.
So it does cause a huge challenge. On one hand, it helps because people see the branding of the National Guard as our soldiers and airmen go out there and help save lives and property here at home, in addition to doing our overseas mission. But also, we do get quite a bit of deployment fatigue. Our operations tempo for sending soldiers and airmen overseas is to engage in the conflicts, and our engagement at the direction of the Department of Defense has been a very heavy burden on us. And then when we have soldiers and airmen that are deployed domestically for hundreds of days on time for what is supposed to be a part-time force, it does present challenges.
I want to ask Minister Shukri, you have so many challenges from drought and other environmental issues in Somaliland. How does your country handle these kinds of challenges and the lack of resources that is often the case?
Well, from 1997 until 2017, we had 9 episodes of droughts. 9 episodes of droughts. We had another episode of cyclone, Saga, this year. So you can imagine, millions of people were affected. From 2015 to 2017, we have lost at least 70 to 80% of the livestock. 70 to 80% of the livestock. 3 consecutive years of droughts. People could not cope with it. Previously, there were, in every decade or in every 15 years, there used to be a drought. And that drought used to be named, a name, but not anymore. It is so frequent that you can imagine so much displacement, so much migration, and so much destitute. For the government to deal with such issues, it became a priority. Leaving the basic needs of the people, literally fighting with the climate change, feeding the destitute people. It is not easy, and it is not, and it's very expensive. With the international community supporting, literally for those 3 years, it took the resources and the revenues of the whole government. So you can imagine with the climate change, how climate change affected the people's lives and livelihoods.
Now, in the absence of some other leadership, corporate America has stepped up. Secretary Schultz was talking about that. Kevin Rabinovich is the Global Sustainability Officer for Mars Incorporated. Why does Mars see this as a major issue of corporate responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting us to be here. So I would actually challenge the question a little bit. So I think this is not just about corporate responsibility. This is about being a good business, which is both being a financial, profitable, thriving business, and a business that is part of a thriving, profitable, prosperous world. And our business can't succeed in an economy and in a world that is struggling and failing. Where countries are having problems producing agriculture. Yes, of course, that's a problem for our supply chain, but it's obviously a problem for the people that are part of our supply chains. And at the end, we are the people that work at Mars. We are the people, the smallholder farmers that are part of our supply chain, and we rely on them to make our business what it is. I think it's sort of more common, frankly, for me to be on a panel with people that do stuff like sell yogurt and shampoo and laptops. So the opportunity to sort of talk about this for us, we would usually say supply chain security, and if that's too abstract, think chocolate security, right?
Now you're talking my language.
Exactly, right? So it's usually the way we think about it, but there's a huge overlap between the things that threaten our supply chain and the people that are part of our supply chain, and the sorts of things that people that think in terms of national security think about. And the reality is as an agricultural business, the roots of our business happen outside in farming communities all over the world. And those communities are seeing the consequences of climate change, be it wildfires here in California, heat waves in Europe, hurricanes in both the Atlantic and the Pacific at the moment. So that's why it's important to us, is because it's what it takes to run our business and to meet the needs of our consumers and to help support the smallholder farmers that are part of our supply chain.
And what are some of your strategies, if there's a way to sort of generalize or give some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two layers of strategy. So one is clearly business and sort of the global economy in general has been a significant contributor to the problem, as have, frankly, all the global citizens of the world in terms of our energy consumption and our behaviors. So there's things we're doing to try and reduce the contribution that we and our supply chain makes to the problem. So we have targets on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions consistent with science. We set those starting back in 2008, and those now cover our entire value chain. So that's sort of trying to stop contributing to the problem. However, we're far enough in at this point that people are already experiencing and facing those problems. So there we pivot in addition to reduce the impact, to manage the impact that's already coming. So there we work on resilience initiatives with, again, as I mentioned, many of our smallholder farmers around the world. We actually just yesterday, with some other corporate partners and BSR, an NGO that many people probably know, launched a new initiative to try and develop a more standardized approach for corporates to think about how to understand and map resilience. And the idea behind that is if there's a better understanding of how to think about it and map it, there'll be more activity to address it. So one of the barriers for corporates is a lot of this space is new and it's confusing and it's uncertain, and that leads to hesitation. So if we can sort of remove some of those barriers and go, no, here's how to think about it, here's how to plan, here's how to prioritize, it enables people to move into action.
And that gets me to the sort of, what is the definition of national security in this context? Sharon Burke, you've had experience in the Pentagon, at the State Department, in different administrations, and now with New America. How do you bring all of this together and redefine how to make America and the world more secure?
It's a wonderful question. Particularly, we have this great panel that's got a full spectrum of security perspectives. And climate change, if you've been here for this conference, talking about it as a security issue probably hasn't been all that common. So why do we talk about it that way? On one end, it's about war and about crisis and about needing the military means to deal with wars and crises. So it's natural disasters and things that only the National Guard in our country can do. But then it's also, how does food and water and politics melt together to cause a situation that can lead to war? And then it becomes a war-fighting thing. So there's security in that sense, in terms of the military and war-fighting. But then there's security in a broader sense, which is human security. And that, at its most basic, security is having food, having access to clean water and sanitation, being able to walk down the street, being able to send your children to school, to have a job and a livelihood. And we in this country don't have to think about those things as being at risk. But climate change threatens all of that. So it may mean war on one end of the spectrum. It may mean that the food supply or that access to water is threatened on the other. And it's that full spectrum of security issues and why climate change should be looked at as a security issue. That doesn't mean it's something you can attack with a gun, which is something that would be interesting too to hear the panel talk about. Is so if you see it as something that creates insecurity, then how do you deal with that? And how do you look at climate change as something you can make more secure? Not with a gun. So with what then?
I think when Flint happened, and now more recently we've seen problems in the Detroit city water supply, it brings home problems that we used to associate with third world countries. And many people thought, well, you can put that to the side. Not people here, but who are more globally concerned and more globally experienced. But to see those kinds of deficits of lack of clean water in a major U.S. city, and it continues. It has not been fixed.
I think this is something, I know that at a top level there's a political debate, and that I don't understand, having worked for both parties. I don't understand why it's a debate, and I know you just talked about that with Secretary Schultz. But at a very human level, in cities across this country, people know this is happening. They see the changes, and they know that in their backyards, the same way they do in Somaliland and everywhere else, they see it. Whether or not they know what it is and put a name to it and know why their security is undermined is another story. But this is happening everywhere, and people are experiencing it at the very human level. People know it's changing.
And when in Somaliland, when you have so many droughts, such a loss of livestock, so many famines, leading to migration. Migration leads to inevitable conflicts, and you have other inherent conflicts and the threat of terrorism, and you have people living in refugee camps for generations in places where I visit, more commonly in the Middle East. You are creating new generations of fighters who make us less secure.
Well, in the city, the capital of Somaliland, Hargeisa, we had at least 10 new camps in the last 4 years, 10 new camps. You can imagine all these people in the camps need to be fed 3 times a day. They have to have a monthly ration, either from WFP or from the government or from the international community. That's one thing. The other thing is, because there is high unemployment, they are unskilled, uneducated, illiterate. These people, the youth specifically, are so prone to crimes. Youth gangs, which Somaliland had no experience in, are now increasing. Youth crimes. A few months ago, there was a group of youth who went into a mosque where people were praying. And in fact, they covered their faces and they robbed their shoes and the cell phones. You can imagine the boldness of the youth going into a mosque where people were praying, unusual for Somaliland. So it creates crimes, gangs, workers. And then the other thing is that people are, when they are so vulnerable, they have to really move. They are moving from rural areas to urban areas, a huge migration. People are also moving from the cities, going through, within the Somali region, going through Ethiopia, Djibouti, Sudan, all the way to Libya, crossing the sea, whether they die or not, going to Europe. The money they spend on one trip is $7,000 to $8,000 US dollars. And the kids, or the youth who are really illegally immigrating, are not going to pay at that time. It is go, pay later, by a group of smugglers. It's a kind of a network who are taking the kids out, of the country. So you can imagine when somebody is so vulnerable, they are so susceptible to do anything, So security, migration, and climate change are one. We can't separate it. Literally, we can't separate it.
And of course, you see this on the front lines all the time.
Of course we do. Does climate change cause conflict? No, but it is a huge contributor to the insecurity that drives conflict. I'll give 2 examples. In the Syrian civil war, you had 1 million refugees coming in from Iraq that moved into Damascus and other towns in Syria, big cities in Syria. At the same time, they had an unprecedented drought. So the Syrian farmers moved into the cities because they couldn't make a livelihood anymore. You put 1 million plus, close to 2 million new people into an environment where nobody has a job, nobody has any hope. It's a ripe, fertile ground, especially with an oppressive government, to cause conflict. So when you have fragile governments and sprinkle on top of it climate change and the effects of climate change through food insecurity, water insecurity, things like that, it's going to cause conflict. It's tinder for conflict. The other example we have more experience with in the California National Guard is we have a partnership with Nigeria. So we spend a lot of time sending soldiers and airmen into the Lake Chad Basin to work with the security forces from those countries. In that case, that lake is drying up, the river is drying up, and all those people that made their livelihood with that river now are unemployed with nothing to do. It's a very fertile breeding ground for recruitment by Boko Haram. Again, climate change has a huge contributing factor to insecurity and security problems around the globe. It's something that we have to prepare for. We have to change and adapt the way that we forecast future conflicts in the Department of Defense and in the National Guard. We have to build our own resilience so that our training strategies, where we used to be able to go out pretty much most of the year in California and shoot live fire exercises and things now if we go even in the height of what was the rainy season, we start fires. So we have to change the way that we prepare ourselves to go deal with conflict and combat operations. So at the end of the day, we have a lot of work to do. One thing that the Department of Defense is doing, and we're doing in the California National Guard also, is are we going to solve climate change? No, because it's not our mission. It's not our job. Our job is to deal with it, to deal with the second and third order effects. But we can serve, just like so many corporations are working to do, as role models and some people that can set the example of how we are changing our practices to be more sustainable. In the California National Guard, we're building a new headquarters building, which will be the state of California's first zero net energy building. And we're very, very proud of that. Is that going to make a big difference? No. But maybe it'll encourage other people to do the same, because if we can do it, they certainly can do it.
And where is that being built? Is that in Sacramento?
Sacramento.
Sacramento. Has recruitment faltered? Is that a challenge for you?
Recruitment is always a challenge because the available people that are qualified to serve in the U.S. military shrinks every year from a number of factors. However, we're meeting or achieving all of our recruiting goals, so it may be counterintuitive that the more stress our force is under, it seems like the more people want to join. Maybe it's because the National Guard's a little bit different. We're not just like the rest of the armed forces off doing stuff overseas, but because we do that and do stuff here at home, it's very attractive and it's a great way to serve. So if there's anybody out in the audience who wants to join, come see me. It's a great part-time job.
Kevin Rabinovich, tell me how your company, how Mars, developed this mission, this expanded mission. You explained how it makes so much sense from a corporate perspective, from a business perspective, from a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah.
But how unusual is it?
Well, less and less unusual, which is encouraging in the corporate sector. Certainly not ubiquitous yet, but hopefully someday soon. For Mars, the journey towards our sustainability program really started in 2007, where I would say we made sort of a pivot from being a company that was a good corporate citizen, that was responsible, and where there was, I guess what I would describe as sort of an open door policy to people that wanted to do sort of clever environmental or clever social things. So we had one of the first installations in the US of using something that looks more like a wetland or a swamp to treat wastewater instead of big concrete tanks and pumps and mixers. So we started putting some of those in the 1980s. But what we didn't have was a sort of proactive, prescriptive objective we were trying to accomplish. So that was really the pivot that we made, was going from we do good stuff, we're open to it, to no, we actually want to achieve some specific objectives. We have some specific goals. I would hesitate to say a mission, but to use the language. And as we thought about trying to get more organized and more structured, we sort of cast around to learn and seek to understand. And what very quickly becomes apparent in thinking about the environmental side of sustainability, at least, and particularly with climate change, is this is a problem that has been understood, measured, and dimensionalized using science, right? So it's an atmospheric chemistry problem, it's an energy problem, it's a science problem, and as a business that fundamentally makes its living on applied food science, taking raw materials that maybe taste okay and turning them into products that taste amazing through food science. We are very comfortable with the idea of using science as a way of thinking about and framing problems. And frankly, it didn't really occur to us to think about climate change in any other way than that. It was sort of so obviously the right way to think about it. The challenge came in, so what the science tells you is necessary is not at all obvious how to achieve. So we went through the brain damage exercise in trying to figure out what to do as opposed to what the goal should be. And that's taken us some time, and we've done a lot of work there. But it's actually been a really powerful tool for us inside the business. People talk about stretch goals as being something that sort of pulls you beyond what you know how to do. And there's a lot of examples of that. There's a lot of evidence of that. The challenge with the stretch goal is you kind of know it's just more than you knew you could do. You said 10, so you were asked to do 12. It's kind of arbitrary. The great thing about the challenge of a science-based goal to try and deal with climate change is it's a goal that's out there that you don't know how to do, but it's not just an arbitrary number. There's a reason to stretch. So you get that sort of benefit of the motivation and the challenge. So, in our commitments, we're committed to zero emissions from our direct operations, factories, and offices by 2040. That required us to start to learn more about renewable energy and how to do renewable energy at scale. And now we have national renewable electricity projects in 9 countries around the world, covering more than a third of our energy, and by 2020 it'll be 2/3. I can say with absolute confidence we would not have done that work if not for taking a science-based approach to climate change. And we've done that work in a way that is actually saving our business money. So that's a strategy that's good for our business, that's good for the climate, and we wouldn't have gotten there without taking the lens of science. So I think it's important to recognize that, and you made a comment earlier, at the local level, I've been on lots of panels with mayors of cities, and almost universally they say, oh yeah, of course this is happening because my city's flooding, or the river flooded, or there's a drought, or whatever. And the closer you are to on the ground and the closer you are to the facts of what's really happening, the more evident this is. And we talked about this earlier before the panel, and so that's why we're after it, and that's what's really motivated us.
It's extraordinary because you think, Sharon, you worked at high levels in the government under Republican and Democratic administrations. How did the government become the problem, not the problem solver?
I wonder that all the time. It happened very gradually, but it's. I know the way you mean it, where we've demonized government at a popular level. Like, is there a Hollywood movie these days that isn't about the government being the enemy? I don't know how we got there, but in a different way, it's a problem too. Because I was thinking about it. What are our defense priorities? And where does our government put its money? We, disproportionately put our money into defense. And the budget is over $700 billion. The administration asked for and got more than $700 billion. Now, the Guard is worth every penny it gets and more, right? So I'll just say that. They're a very busy force, and they're deploying to military missions, and they're keeping people safe here at home, and they don't get what they need all the time or what they deserve. And so, there's a lot of good spending that goes on, but still, that $700 billion is for war fighting. Where's the rest of our capacity in our government? This is a security issue too. Whose job is it to deal with it? Like, I agree with you, it's not a military mission. You can't defeat it with a gun. So whose job is it? Where is the capacity in our government to build security to deal with climate change? So in that sense, our government is also failing us, in that we're not building up the means the way a company is, like Mars, to deal with this issue. And Minister Shukri and I were talking backstage that when you talk about these issues, we can all sit here and say, this is existential. This is about the future and about security at a very basic level. But in the priority list for a government, it comes last. So that's something we've got to change. And we've got to start putting our money not just in legacy military systems that cost a lot of money and that are probably not what we need for our future defense. We also need to figure out how we build civilian capacity and how we build societal capacity to deal with these issues and not have such a disproportionate focus on one kind of government capability.
It's a really different definition. And I suspect that the change would not have happened at Mars if it didn't. It may have come from bottom up, but a decision had to be made from the top down that this was a good strategy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, someone had to give me my job,
Yeah.
right? So I was happily working in research and development, designing, new types of pet food and leading a team of scientists and engineers, and then move over to this role. Maybe just to add on to response to your last question is, to the point you made of, that the military's job is not to solve climate change, but to deal with the consequences of it. I think government can play an incredible role in helping solve and prevent the worst consequences of climate change. There are all sorts of technologies, even just in the renewable energy sector, that have their roots in work that was either in the military or came out of DARPA, or I met a startup company yesterday that got a lot of their funding through ARPA-E that are doing some amazing things. And so I think there's absolutely a role, not just in regulation, although that's important as well, but in basic research and funding and science. There's a lot that can happen. For Mars, I think it's a case of, again, and I sort of said it earlier, it's very hard to run a thriving, prosperous business in a world that is not thriving and prosperous. So we have something we call the 5 principles, and one of them is this principle called mutuality, and that's basically what it says, is that we will succeed when the people around us, and sort of all the way back to the end of the value chain and all the way out to our customers and the communities they operate in, when they succeed, we succeed. When farmers are hungry or dealing with drought or crisis, they are not the best farmers they could be, because they have some more urgent crisis they need to deal with. They don't have the resources to make the best decisions.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
When we're talking about countries like Somaliland and other places where nothing will undermine your security faster than not having food or having food prices escalate. You said you started out in research and development. Are we going to be able to go to places like Somaliland that are having unprecedented droughts, or California,
Yeah.
where there's water problems and fire, and find new kinds of agriculture? Because I don't see how we can be secure if we can't grow for the future.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's a great point. So I think what I would say to that is, so there are more than 1 billion smallholder farmers around the world, who are growing a whole range of agricultural commodities for either local consumption or for the global market on really small, plots of land, 1 hectare, 2 hectares, things like that. And the productivity of those farms is a fraction of what it could be, and what it is, frankly, in sort of more developed nations where people have tools and resources and inputs. And I think, a lot of times smallholder farmers in the food sector are sort of talked about as either the victims, so they're the ones who are going to be suffering from climate change, or they're the villains, because they're sort of reluctant villains. They're chopping down the forest, but they're chopping down the forest to feed their children, so can you really blame them? And so the sort of victims or villains. And I think the opportunity, which is sort of what you allude to, is to make them the heroes of the story, right? Because the fact that there's this, and it varies by material, but there's this tremendous opportunity to improve the productivity and the yield of those crops by bringing in, and I say technology, technology can be, this is the right way to prune your cocoa tree, right? It's, not, heavy technology. And financial resources, but the challenge is a lot of the tools that make sort of industrial agricultural as productive and as efficient as it is result from the fact that there's a lot of scale, right? When you're very small and don't have any kind of banking relationship and don't have any kind of assets and don't have any collateral, it's finding ways to sort of kickstart that virtuous cycle. And so that's what a lot of Mars and other companies are doing, working in smallholder agriculture. So we have a fund that we're involved with called the Livelihoods Fund, where we've put some capital in to help try and sort of kickstart that virtuous cycle. So it's a challenge, but at the same time, it's an opportunity, because we know how much better it could be.
I want to ask, especially because we're in California, ask you about the wildfires. There's a lack of understanding, I think, nationally as to how and why it became so severe this year. And whether that's predictable, whether you can ramp up, and whether you now have to budget and train in a different way, because this is going to be the trend in the future.
So it is predictable, and that wildfires will continue to get worse in California. And there's a number of factors. First of all, first and foremost, the climate has changed. We're seeing much drier conditions. We're having long periods of drought. There's a lot of tree mortality that's a result of that. In addition, California's population is booming. We have 39 million people jammed into a state that used to have 300,000 people before our country was a country. And that causes problems as people move into the urban wildland interface. There's more structures that are at risk because in places that used to just burn, they're now burning down homes and businesses. Our forest management practices have changed over the last couple of decades, where we've allowed the fuel load to get so high that it's extreme because of decisions that others made that maybe we don't want to let fires burn, put them out fast, and we stopped doing controlled burns. There's a lot of talk within the forestry community about how to get after that to help mitigate that problem. But at the end of the day, with the trends in the climate going the way they are, this problem is going to continue to get worse. What that means for us within the state government, within the National Guard, and our first responder community is that we are coming up with ways to be more innovative, to get after fires faster, to be able to protect people, to be able to get people to evacuate faster, to make sure that it's the responsibility of everyone living within California, that they're responsible for their own safety, first and foremost, that they need to be ready to go, they need to be tuned in and be aware of fire conditions so they don't get trapped and they don't suffer a tragedy as a result. We have a lot of work to do. We're also doing a lot to innovate. Within California National Guard, we were the first to fly unmanned drones that were weapons of war that we now use routinely to help with fire mapping and damage assessments. We're looking at space-based systems that maybe perhaps will be able to enable us to detect fires very quickly, quicker than somebody out on the ground. And we're looking to leverage all of that in order to help get after this problem. But I will tell you one thing on climate change, for people that are climate change non-believers, disbelievers, or whatever, go talk to someone in the forestry business or go talk to a wildland firefighter, and that'll change your view in a heartbeat because they're dealing with it each and every day. CAL FIRE is a wonderful organization, and their firefighters have not had a break this year. The California National Guard ebbs and flows into this firefight, but those men and women are out there saving lives and property and dealing with this tremendous problem that's come because of climate change.
Minister Shukri, as you look for more resources, what do you look toward? Do you look towards the United Nations? Do you have any external resources that can help you both with the migration problem and with the drought?
Well, first of all, we have to really address the drivers of the climate change. We literally have to address it. We have to have enough resources allocated for the climate change adaptation, resilience, and whatever. Education is a priority too. People are not aware of what's happening in that area because they are not used to it. They are not used to it. As I said, if a drought comes, it's 15 years later. And then their coping mechanism was, but now their coping mechanism is zero, literally is zero. So what we are looking forward is at least let the people understand that this is what is happening. Not only in Somaliland, not only in Horn of Africa, it's all around the world. It's happening in the United States. We are talking about it now. It's happening everywhere. And from south, north, east, west of the world. And I believe God has given us a beautiful earth, a beautiful world to live in. But if we can't take care of it, and our demand is so, we are always demanding, and we are not putting back anything in it. It's a huge problem. It's not from a bucket of money, or it is from here. We have to really work hard from here, from our hearts.
Well, I can't think of a better way to conclude this. You have heard the experiences of these panelists, General Baldwin and Minister Shukri and Kevin Rabinovich and Sharon Burke. We want to thank you because the solution really does rest with all of us. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for our final panel, From this session, I want to introduce John Podesta, the founder and director of the Center for American Progress, of course, a former White House chief of staff, a lifelong environmentalist, chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, and someone who has brought environmental issues to the center of national policymaking. And Andrea Marr, a former naval officer and currently a program manager at Wildon, who brings technical expertise as well as her military expertise to this whole challenge. So, John Podesta and Andrea, please join us.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
So you get me first, and we're almost done. But Andrea and I have the pleasure of wrapping this session up. And as we've heard on these great panels, climate change demands a shift in how we view our national security. A 21st century national security paradigm must move beyond traditional military threats to incorporate growing population pressures and the food and water scarcity that scientists are warning us will worsen in a warmer world, while understanding that the traditional military threats to the United States are likely to shift theaters as a result of climate change, as we've just heard. In my role in government, as Andrea noted, I saw firsthand that we have to be well-structured to deal with these kinds of complex security issues. The military will tell you that refugees are not a military issue, one that you cannot handle with the force of arms. But at the same time, recent experience has proven that it's very much a genuine security issue, and the military is often called upon to respond. Human tragedy destabilizes every place it touches, but who handles that? Who makes policy to address these issues? In a sense, climate change means the end of political one-dimensionality. These new complex crisis scenarios have the potential to threaten the entire multilateral system of the international community if we do not do more to step up our efforts to address climate change. Unfortunately, the current occupant of the Oval Office is not one for complexity. The current administration, I think, in my view, is incurring unspeakable debt to future generations. This is reckless and irresponsible given the devastating effects that we are already witnessing. Just look at the Carolinas, the Eastern Caribbean, what's going on in the Philippines. We're entering the uncharted waters of the 21st century, and we urgently require a new understanding and new concepts to guide our climate development and our security policies. This is no longer tomorrow's problem. The effects of climate change are too visible today, from droughts to heat waves, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, extreme storms, historic devastating wildfires right here in California and across the West. More people are on the move than any time before. Massive population growth, demographic changes, and increased mobility will only exacerbate the effects of climate change. The International Organization for Migration is using the most widely accepted recent estimate that a staggering 200 million individuals are projected to be on the move by the second half of the century. In the Obama administration, which I served in, we undertook several different efforts to update our institutions and inscribe the urgent threat into our country's public understanding, plans, and priorities. They were fully aware of the global risk of climate change and how global governance and stability will be impacted in decades to come. I want to read something to you because 2010 was an important turning point for the U.S. government's attitude towards the strategic and security dimension of global warming. For the first time, the Quadrennial Defense Review, the basic planning document for the Pentagon, recognized that climate change as a threat multiplier with the potential to exacerbate current challenges. The document warned, and I'm quoting, "The effects of climate change in North Africa are likely to exacerbate existing threats to the region's water and food resources, could generate localized social and governmental collapses, humanitarian crises. Climate change will likely increase the already substantial migration of North Africans to Europe. The region will also serve as a route for transmigration if sub-Saharan Africans flee climate stress." Today, we understand the foresight of that document when we observe the Mediterranean, where nearly 10,000 migrants have drowned or gone missing since 2016 alone. This summit has shown, as Secretary Mabus said, that we have warfighters for whom the risk of climate change is deeply ingrained. And we have city, state, and other leaders across the country that are taking up the mantle of U.S. climate leadership, engaging in climate diplomacy, and looking to ramp up international cooperation on a range of climate solutions, as Minister Ismail pointed to, embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the entire 193 countries of the United Nations, also in 2015, the year the Paris Accord was signed, and looking towards financing adaptation, to building sustainable economies, to empowering women and girls, to providing effective family planning to the 200 million women that lack access, building strong institutions that protect peace, justice, and human rights. We need to act with renewed vigor, like the world depends on us, because with all due seriousness, folks, it really does. So with that, I get to turn the podium over to not only a rock star, but a rocket scientist. Please welcome Andrea Marr.
I'm not really a rocket scientist. My bachelor's from the Naval Academy was in aerospace, so I get called that occasionally. So as we've heard here today, combating climate change is complicated, it's political, it's expensive, it's complex. We spent the last hour talking about significant global security challenges, about the threat of sea level rise and Navy bases, and conflict caused as a result of climate change, and about devastating droughts. So you're probably wondering what a program manager from a publicly traded company is doing up here right now. We've heard a lot about the big picture security threat that climate change poses today, but I thought it would be helpful to put a personal perspective on security. As someone who spent the last 8 years working in energy efficiency and energy resilience strategies, I recognize that we need significant institutional change, but I also believe that change requires individual motivation and individual dedication. I have tried to live my life by the Margaret Mead quote, to do all the good I can, when I can, by whatever means I can. But I also recognize that doing good sometimes means different things to different people. I was reminded of that on my bus ride here yesterday, chatting with a man from Puerto Rico who had protested the bombing of Vieques Island and looked at me somewhat skeptically when I told him that I was a Navy veteran worried about climate change. As the biggest challenge of our time, climate change has the potential to unify, but unity requires individuals to engage, even if it's while riding an electric school bus on your way to the Moscone Center. In 2005, I was stationed aboard a US Navy cruiser in the Persian Gulf, doing oil platform defense. And it was there that I had my first climate change epiphany. How was it possible that the US military could spend so much time and divert so many assets just to defend an oil platform? And it wasn't just us. There was an Australian ship and a French ship, all doing the exact same thing, doing circles around an oil platform. The answer to that, of course, is simply that we're all dependent on oil. We being the US military, we being the United States, we being France and everybody else who had a ship deployed to the Northern Arabian Gulf at that time. I say this not as an indictment, but simply as a reality check. For all of our commitments, all of our goals, and our various acronyms that we throw around at climate change conferences, we must bear in mind the paralyzing impact of dependency. It is human to protect our resources, even chocolate. I have been heartened by the last 2 days about the progress we've made in transportation, at development banks, and in cities across the world. But I would urge each of you to recognize that ultimately, this change is occurring thanks to the work of individuals breaking those bonds of dependency. I want you to know that there is a small but growing number of Navy veterans and military veterans in general who take this particular mission very seriously. We work in energy efficiency and in solar and in finance and in policy, and we are motivated by our experiences, our own epiphanies, and above all, a desire to continue our service. We believe that climate change is a threat to our national security and that we have an obligation to continue to contribute in a meaningful way. It's easy to become disheartened by the ongoing crises in our climate, but I will leave you with this thought. 2018 has seen a massive mobilization of activists, of women and people of color running for office and winning, of people willing to buck the status quo. If ever there was a time to answer a call to service, that time is now. Thank you so much for joining us. This concludes the session, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.